Thank you. Well, I'm going to start by talking about the past and the present of Chicago food before I get into the future. And I'm going to focus specifically on restaurants because this is a lightning round. And I'm going to start by speeding through a few key markers in Chicago's culinary history timeline to show how we got to our present point. So it all began in the 1830s when the first grocery store opened and the Chicago meatpacking industry launched. There were no restaurants yet, but there are a handful of oyster depots and oyster saloons thanks to immigrants from New England. In the 1840s and 50s, German immigrants begin to arrive, bringing beer, brats, and bakeries, and the first restaurants appear, listed as eating houses in the city's directory, which also lists an assortment of confectioners, vinegar makers, and pickle warehouses. In the 1860s, the Union Stockyards are founded. Restaurants have come a long way in the past 20 years. Haute cuisine now appears at a place called Crosby's Opera House downtown, where tables are topped with architectural gastronomic features, miniature temples made of nougat, illuminated ice baskets, boned quail in its plumage, and the sort. Then come the 1870s and the Great Chicago Fire, which knocks out all but 5 restaurants. But development springs back in action, and the numbers back up to 200 restaurants within 4 years. In the 1880s, Swedish immigrants begin to arrive, and over the next 20 years, they open so many smorgasbord restaurants in Andersonville that it earns the nickname Herring Alley. In the 1890s, we have the World's Columbian Exposition, and in the 1900s, Greek, Polish, and Jewish immigrants begin to arrive en masse, and Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle. In the 1910s and 20s, restaurant scene is well underway. Opulent Chinese restaurants are in vogue. World War I, cuts off European immigration, but there's a wave of migration from the South. Hotels hold many of the city's stylish dining restaurants, but then Prohibition strikes, and for a decade, the speakeasy rules. In the 40s and 50s, downtown dining is dominated by French restaurants and steakhouses, but developments in casual food are brewing, like Pizzeria Uno and McDonald's in Des Plaines. In the 1960s, the parade of chic French restaurants continues with Maxime's, L'Escargot, the bakery, pictured here, while Chicago's Mexican immigration increases dramatically. In the 70s, French continues to rule Chicago dining with Les Français, Le Perroquet, and Rich Melman begins his Let Us Entertain You empire with R.J. Gruntz. Then in the 80s, we see the opening of some major non-French Chicago players. Spiaggia, Arun's, Frontera Grill, Topolo Bombo, and Charlie Trotter's, which earns accolades and international attention for Trotter's creative, personal cuisine. And on a national level, this is the decade when we really start to see American cuisine in a restaurant context start to slowly and gradually take shape and lay the groundwork for the international credibility that we have today. In the 1990s, Blackbird opens, bringing techniques and ingredients from fine dining into a casual space, further defining American cuisine, and farmers market culture spreads. And then in the 2000s, Chicago becomes the country's epicenter for avant-garde cooking, with Alinea, Modo, Avenue, Schwa gaining international attention and credibility. Food is ornate, fanciful, and spectacular, not unlike what we saw at Crosby's Opera House in the 1860s, but through a distinctly modern lens. Then the recession hits, and the restaurant world worries and contracts, but emerges largely unscathed. And in 2011 and 2012, we see dozens of exciting, noteworthy openings, from chefs launching their first projects or branching out to open a second or third place. Which brings us to today. So what's happening now? Where are we thriving? And where are we coming up short? Chicago has no shortage of culinary creativity, and is absolutely one of the capitals of American culinary innovation. I'd argue that our restaurant scene is even better and more exciting and more varied than San Francisco, and catching up to LA and definitely to New York. And it's not because of the places that are gunning for 3 Michelin stars. It's because of the places that have, in the last decade, grown in what I call the middle ground. Chicago's experienced this remarkable, exciting expansion of the middle ground of restaurants, chef-driven restaurants that serve sophisticated food in casual settings. It's a hotbed of creativity. It's populated by chefs who have fine dining training, but choose to work in a casual context, like Yusho. The chef who ran Charlie Trotter's for 14 years now owns a Japanese-inspired restaurant and a low-key cocktail bar, both of which are adventurous, sophisticated, and refined, but without the trappings of fine dining. Chicago's also home to a robust artisan food culture, one of the best in the country, making small batch jam, chocolate, charcuterie, beer, and spirits. Chefs are getting into the game, launching lines of pasta and sauces. The small local butcher is back. The Midwest is a thriving epicenter of economic and cultural resurgence in this realm, but what we need now is for our local governments and regulatory bodies to actively work to aid this burgeoning entrepreneurial culture rather than inhibit it by strict regulations. Another noteworthy characteristic of today, there's been a value shift among chefs. In the highest tier of dining and in more casual settings, local has replaced luxury. The coveted ingredients are no longer those flown in from Japan or even California. They're the ones sourced from local farmers or even foraged, whether it's a variety of Asian pear or an heirloom purple carrot. This is one of the philosophies that has trickled down from chefs to consumers. Over the past 20 years, culinary techniques, trends, flavors, values have steadily trickled down from the upper echelons of restaurants to the chef-driven middle ground, and then on to home cooks, even consumer products and mainstream chains. One of the most interesting aspects about the present day in Chicago food, however, is that reverse flow, the trickle up. Thanks to the internet, the proliferation of food blogs, consumers and home cooks can be even more informed, even more adventurous than the city's top chefs. One possible reason why, of course, is that most chefs don't have time to trawl blogs and read cookbooks while running a restaurant. But some of what I'm most excited about in food and cooking is the trend towards creative, healthful cooking, which is not yet present in many of Chicago's best restaurants. A handful of artful blogs, like these pictured, have become hugely influential, inspiring an international following to try things like creative plant-based dishes and nut milks, not just to drink, but to use as yogurt and desserts. I know one chef in Chicago, Jared Van Camp at Nell Cote, began experimenting recently with nut milks after a conversation with a local blogger. Unusual and ancient grains, another example. Spelt, kamut, amaranth. The Whole Foods in Lincoln Park has an entire bulk section devoted to these ancient grains, and yet in a restaurant in Chicago, you're hard-pressed to find anything beyond quinoa and farro. Middle Eastern and North African flavors are also sweeping the country and sweeping home cooks, thanks to, in large part, recent cookbooks by Yotam Ottolenghi. But these flavors haven't started to show up on Chicago restaurant menus, even though I have seen them in Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. So what's next? I expect and hope that everything I just mentioned, not only about keeping health in mind, but using health as an inspiration, will begin to be seen increasingly in local restaurants over the next 2 years. We're already starting to see some vegetarian tasting menus. We're also starting to see some examples of young chefs looking to the city's iconic dishes and ethnic heritage for creative inspiration, but I hope to see more, not just chefy versions of Chicago hot dogs, but chefs truly mining Chicago's history of immigrant foodways. The Polish, Swedish, and Greek immigrants who populated the city have little, if any, representation on the chef-driven restaurant table. I hope we'll see young talent focusing their attention on Nordic, Greek, Eastern European, Mexican cuisines. And outside the dining room, I hope to see the continued growth in philanthropy, charity, and cultural leadership by Chicago chefs and restaurateurs, not just by participating in fundraising events, but by creating and participating in local initiatives like Common Threads or Pilot Light, which is a chef-built, chef-run charity that sends chefs into local schools. I hope to see a food incubator open, like La Cocina in San Francisco, Hot Bread Kitchen in New York, a shared-use kitchen space that provides business and culinary resources to food entrepreneurs. And if all of this happens, if we continue to push creative boundaries, mine the past, work together to support culinary entrepreneurship, and venture outside the walls of our kitchens, I have no doubt that Chicago can and will continue to lead American food culture into a very bright future.
Round of applause for Heather Sperling.